So I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. I'm here to kind of cover the Angular as a platform, not Angular as a programming tool, but Angular as a platform. The event is hosted by the St. Louis Angular Meetup. So if you somehow made it here without signing up for the St. Louis Angular Meetup, if you just type that phrase into Bing, you will no doubt find it. Shout out to Microsoft. Okay, so who am I? I do some teaching at Angular Bootcamp, and I am a technical principal at Oasis Digital. So I program things and I teach about them. This is the talk you were promised. So just to show that I really am going to do the talk you were promised, here is our agenda for the talk. So what's a platform? Talk about some ecosystem stuff, talk about some governance, always a hot topic. The bigger the company, the more we care about the governance. And then those 4 key points at the end, productivity, efficiency, reach, and scale, we will conclude by talking about those 4 things. Okay, so Angular is a platform. What does that mean? Well, sometimes people call like an operating system a platform. Sometimes people use that word to refer to an operating system and a whole bunch of the most common infrastructure type software that people run on an operating system. And I think that was great and true, and I used to use that words that way in the, I'm just gonna walk and let the camera miss me. I used to use the words that way in the 80s and 90s. But now I think it's more suitable to think of things you build on the web or for the web as a platform, and Angular is one of those. So in this case, platform just literally means it's a whole bunch of infrastructure, all of which reinforces the rest, which you can build on. That's what a platform means. Now, the platform is sort of a bunch of core things, and there's an ecosystem, things that other people have built around that. So Angular has an ecosystem. Also, Angular consists of many what they call products, which you're going to see in the next slide, and I'm going to tell you about the synergies between them. So I've borrowed, this is my favorite slide, I borrowed this from Brad Green. He's the manager of Angular at Google. He puts this up, I think every time he gives a talk. I think you can go to any talk he's given in the last like 4 years, and this slide is in it. The point of this slide is how many different things are part of Angular. So I'm going to try to talk about each of these things very briefly. If you have questions about how you might actually use this, well, that'd be a great thing to ask Paul after I finish up. Okay, so the first thing on the list there, Angular. So this means Angular, the development tool, the thing you can use to define components and make those components appear on a web page and make data bind to them both ways and make them fetch data from backends and so on. The next piece is Protractor. That is Google's officially sponsored end-to-end testing tool. So you can use that tool to simulate a human stabbing away at a web browser. I encourage someone to ask Paul if there's any alternatives to Protractor they should consider. But Protractor is a very solid tool, and it's actually an Angular-specific wrapper on Selenium. Selenium is part of that ecosystem. So Selenium is not a Microsoft thing, it's not a Google thing, it's just some small company made this tool, which is now like a really critical piece of web infrastructure. Like to a rounding error, every company of any size uses Selenium somewhere for something. It's really important. Oops. Next, forms. So Angular has a form feature. So raise your hand if you do any enterprise development in this room. Okay, the rest of you, what do you do that's not enterprise? Somebody tell me something you do that's not enterprise.
VPN servers.
You're the one who doesn't use forms. Okay, so in our line of work, almost everybody builds apps that has forms. So even if you're building the most amazing, I don't know, 3D immersive environment in the world, the suite of applications around that everybody uses to maintain your interactive 3D suite has a whole lot of forms. I would say Angular is uniquely positioned compared to kind of all the competing ways to build a web app and how well and coherently it handles forms. Angular is just amazingly concise and effective for data binding to and from forms. Next, PWAs. PWAs seem to be the growing new way to do many kinds of mobile apps. So I'm not saying that PWAs are replacing mobile apps. There's still a lot of use cases for like kind of real native mobile apps. But we've been noticing that it used to be only certain narrow cases could you do like a web mobile wrapper sort of thing, but now with this PWA technology, I don't know, I think maybe as many as 80% of mobile apps out there could be PWAs instead. I'm not going to go into what PWAs are in depth, just that it's a really great way to make a great mobile experience, like faster to get the user to start using than a native mobile app, but just as sticky to keep them using it as a native mobile app. Next, Uugury. Uugury is a development tool. This came from the ecosystem, but I believe now it has some official support of some kind from Google. It is a tool that you can use in your browser while you're developing to sort of, it's like X-ray vision into your application to sort of see the programming constructs that make up the screens in front of you. Next, language services. So that is a piece of IDE tooling. This lets you plug into your favorite IDE. My favorite IDE is Microsoft Visual Studio Code. Anybody else use Visual Studio Code? Yeah. Visual Studio Code is like sweeping across the industry. It is so widely used. It is so useful. It has its own vast ecosystem, but the language server is where Angular touches Visual Studio Code and similar tools. Next, router. Router is just one piece of Angular. Some apps use it, some apps don't, but it provides a standard way that every Angular developer can use to set up a translation between like navigation versus what part of an app you land in. There are competing tools I like very much, where you have to go shopping like outside, like in the ecosystem, to pick out a router. With Angular, there's a router in the box. It is blessed, it is supported. Next, Angular Elements. So Angular Elements, this is a way of making web components with Angular. So web components is becoming the, I guess, lingua franca of how to make reusable bits of program across that aren't specific to any one framework, right? Like you could make an Angular element with Angular, and that actually is a web component. Then you could go take out your legacy PHP app, and you could drop that web component in it and wire it up and have it work. So Angular sort of seamlessly embraces web components. Now, on the first of those, I was telling kind of the whole truth. On this one, I'm leaving out an important part, which is that we actually have to wait a couple more major versions of Angular for elements to be really small and compact. So be a little bit careful with that one if you need it right now. Okay, so CDK. The Angular team noticed that building a component set is a really common thing to do. As far as we can tell at Oasis Digital, almost every big company we come in contact with is building their own like reusable component set to use across hundreds or thousands of applications in their company. The Angular folks who are building Angular material, which I'll get to soon, realize that there's a bunch of sort of common infrastructure you need if you're going to build a component set. And so Angular ships with, like officially supported, this toolkit, which is a very, like a high quality, well thought out solution if you want to build a company specific reusable component set. In the box, ready for consideration. Next, universal. This is what they call their pre-rendering. So if you want to make that very first page load of an application you built with Angular happen as fast as possible, you can render the HTML on the server. And again, it's not a random ecosystem piece of code where you're on your own to pick it out and try to wire it up. It's like the same team has people working on Angular Universal as the other parts. So you can have a reasonable expectation that you can pick up all these products in the platform, and to an approximation, you can get them to work together. Next, Karma is a unit testing tool. If you know what one of those is, you probably want it. Angular Labs is the next one. That's their code name for ideas that are only half-baked. So there are a bunch of ideas kind of for the future of Angular that are not yet fully ready, and they've grouped those under the term Angular Labs. So companies that are pushing the envelope in a certain way can go pick up these Angular Labs tools, and they sort of have a lower level of promise associated with them than with the rest of the product suite. They haven't shipped for real yet. Next, compiler. This is just a reminder that Angular, the tool for web development tool, operates as a compiler. It does a bunch of the hard work when you build your software so that at runtime things go smaller and faster. So many of the competing tools do not work on the basis of a compiler, although some do. And I actually predict that Angular's kind of leading the way there. I would guess that 4 years from now, the top 3, whatever they are at the time, tools for building rich web applications will all use a compiler of some kind because it's just such a compelling benefit to how fast things get up and running at runtime. Next, I18N. So Angular has fairly pervasive internationalization support in the box. Angular as a platform and as a tool is well suited if you have to serve people around the world. Next, Material. Material is Google's design system. Since I'm standing in a Microsoft facility, if I could remember the name of Microsoft's design system. What? Fluid. Fluid? Fluid, okay. I wonder if there's a Fluid implementation for Angular yet. I would guess there is. Fluent, okay. So Material is Google's design system, which you are very familiar with if you use any of their sites for anything. There's an implementation of that called Angular Material, which feels very native. Paul, who you can ask questions about it later, I believe uses Angular Material for almost everything. Is that right, Paul?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, animation. So Angular, the platform and the tool, are suited for making like consumer-grade applications. And like, we live in this weird world of software dev. Like, out in the world of like power tools, professional grade means it's better than consumer grade. But in the world of software development, consumer grade actually means it's better. Consumer grade means very polished, like something someone would go spend their money on purpose at a store. Many applications, both sold by and used inside big companies, have a very clunky, boring feel compared to consumer apps. One of the many things you have to do to make that not the case is to do some animation, and that is well supported in the box. Then lastly, CLI, it's a set of tools that make it super easy to get up and running with all the right build and development time tooling, and it just arrives in the box. You don't go shopping for Webpack plugins. You don't go find someone's boilerplate and copy it and hope that it's reasonably up to date. None of that. It's a tool that just does the right build tooling for you to get up and running. So that's it. That's the whole platform. We're done. Wait, no, we're not quite done. Okay, so is there an ecosystem? Well, I sure think there is, because there sure are a lot of people using it. And it seems to be, is that? I don't know what the axes are to know if that's literally exponential, but it is really growing fast. This is the traffic to the documentation website, which is the best proxy anybody's been able to come up with for like the level of aggregate usage. The challenge is that many people use many programming tools behind a corporate firewall. And so things like the number of downloads of the tool are actually a pretty unreliable indicator of the number of people actually using it. Some of the competing tools chase the number of GitHub stars. But I believe that the number of GitHub stars is like only looking at like kind of a certain part of the market. And I think this is the better job of assessing what the total market looks like, because users both inside and outside of big companies typically look at the same documentation site if they're using a tool. Next, what is the governance of this thing like? Is this just like some random crap that could disappear at any time? The answer is no. Google, I believe they most recently announced they have over 1,000 internal projects built on Angular and the Angular platform. So it's probably not going away. Furthermore, the Angular team, which we'll see a picture of in a minute, is tasked with making sure that each new version of Angular does not break any of those 1,000 applications, right? So they have an extremely rigorous governance process about what goes into Angular. I believe they've said if they break any of the 1,000 downstream internal consumers, the Angular team, not that application team, is responsible for fixing it. So they, I really have never seen, actually, put an asterisk by that never. I have rarely seen any company take backward compatibility so seriously as is done on this. And the asterisk, which I'll give the shout out to Microsoft because they're in their space, is it is really stinking amazing that you could like pull out some app that was compiled and built in like 1996 and drop it on Windows in like 2012, and it would usually work. So that actually is another example of amazing backward compatibility. Lastly, there's some significant investment. So I don't know, anybody who's ever been involved in like budgets for software projects knows if you have 43 amazing people working on a project, you take it pretty seriously financially. So they're spending a lot of money making this thing good. So I feel like Angular, the platform, and the library are very safe choices to rely on at scale, like for a long time. Okay, final 4 points. Why does all this matter? So productivity, right? Productivity is really, really important. We all each only have so many hours in the day. The more we can get done, right? The more value we can create. Further our own careers can go, the further our teams can go, the further our companies we work at can go. By building on this broad and tall platform, it's not the only broad and tall platform, but by building on this one, you'll get a lot more productivity than if you're picking up low-level tools and kind of cobbling them together at a per project level. Interestingly, again, I'm going to tie this into Microsoft because they're in their space. It kind of harkens back to what I remember like .NET being like 10 plus years ago, where there was a whole big pile of tools that you could just kind of grab them all and they would all kind of work together. I will point out though, get a little shade in, Microsoft had this habit of reinventing .NET every few years, and it got a little tough to keep up. So I have some scars from decades past. I believe those scars will not be repeated in Angular. I think an Angular program written today will survive shockingly long relative to how fast things turn over in the web platform in general. Okay, next, efficiency. This one kind of gets to the heart of the biggest problem in software. The biggest problem in software from the point of view of people whose budgets go towards software is it takes like a dump truck full of money to get anything working, right? So what that means, when people complain this took too long and cost so much, what they really meant is the efficiency was too low, right? So I mean efficiency in the sense you learned it in high school physics, right? Just the ratio of output to input. By building on a big platform where a lot of decisions have been made and somebody else is responsible for making all the pieces work together, you tend to have, no guarantees, but you tend to have more output per unit of input. So if your project is going to have 30 programmer months on it, you'll probably get more features working over that scope of time if you build on a very good platform versus if you sort of pick up little tools that you have to start cobbling together on your own. Next, second to last actually, reach. So reach means how far can I go? Like to how many different kinds of places can I go with the same set of programming tools? Angular's pretty good for this one also. So this first thing on the left, these two things on the left are actually just snippets of screenshots of the Angular homepage. And so, early on they talked about one framework for mobile and desktop, but they actually mean desktop web, not desktop native. They mean like desktop web, which I found a little strange. But Angular's reach goes much farther than is implied by just one framework, mobile and desktop. So the Angular team and the tools they're working on have this growing obsession with making payloads smaller over time. It's the strangest thing. In most tools, most dev tools I've ever used, and I've used dev tools for a long time, each new version, it was better and it had more features, but the output was bigger and slower. Like this has been my experience for decades. Strangely enough, with each new version of Angular, each new version has been smaller and faster because they're trying to make sure that this has the reach where you can use this to build things that run well on like a crappy cheap cell phone on a iffy 3G mobile connection in the middle of nowhere anywhere in the world. And they seem to take it pretty seriously. As far as I know, there have been no regressions with each version producing better output than the one before. There have been no cases where, oh, we can't upgrade to the new version because it makes the files too much bigger. I've never seen that happen. Okay, and then the very last thing, Angular is suited to building big things. And so I put this last because this one has a little bit of a trade-off in it. If you're not building a big thing, I have a much less compelling case, right? Somebody who's just building one little tiny app that's only going to be used by 10 people in their department, I actually would encourage you, like, explore. Just pick something interesting and use it. It'll be fine. You'll probably learn interesting things. But if you're trying to pick like a platform to eventually have 400 developers working with across your whole division, with apps that are going to be used across a whole company and so on, Angular's features are all about supporting that scale. And I don't know that it's so much because somebody sat down and said they need to be that. It's just that's how it's grown. Because all the people that work on the core work at Google who uses it for scaled big things. So I think that essentially you can pick up some free benefit, right? You don't have to pay for it. You just adopt a tool by somebody who has problems and experience dealing with scale, and you get a tool which is well suited to deal with scale. Then my final bit, anybody in a company where doing builds is a giant pain, look at this Google thing called Bazel. It's pretty slick. I won't talk about it anymore tonight, though. You can ask Paul. Okay, so that is the end of what I have. I always put up this thing that we're hiring developers, instructors, and so on. Thank you all for coming, and I think I will do a few minutes of Q&A before I leave all the hard problems for Paul. Does that work for you, Paul? Okay. I gotta get to this party. Whatever happened out here sounds a lot more fun.
Yeah, sounds like a fun one. All right, so I'm from WWT. We build a lot of enterprise apps, and what has happened is
Try to get the microphone.
Oh yeah, I was all right, deep and loud. All right, Angular 1 was our app. We have an e-commerce application, and then what we've been doing is we noticed that there were a lot of performance issues with Angular itself. And at the time, Angular 2 launched, and it was quite a steep learning curve for a lot of the folks who were on the development team. And our core group kind of evaluated Vue at the time, and we noticed that, oh, it's totally similar to Angular 1, and it does not have as much of a, I would say, performance issue like Angular 1 had. So we actually figured out a way to integrate Vue components into the Angular application. So I've not looked into documentation after 2+ of Angular. What has the Google team done to improve performance?
So everything I hear about Angular is their name for the product from version 2 onward. A predecessor product, AngularJS, like what they have in common is like the first N letters of the name and a lot of the ideas, but there's no code in common between AngularJS and Angular. It's probably a little bit easier to learn Angular if you knew AngularJS, but coming from Vue is just as easy as coming from AngularJS. In terms of what's happened since version 2, it's just gotten relentlessly better. Just unbelievable pace of getting relentlessly better. Bug after bug squashed. Every little piece of performance keeps getting optimized. Output size keeps getting optimized. I would actually describe Vue as a fantastic tool for like building apps in the small. But I would say the big differentiator, if you want to compare Vue and Angular, is that Angular has this vast platform, and Vue has like a couple of pieces of it. And so if you're evaluating like tools to build a little like departmental thing, then you'd kind of compare. I mean, they would be directly comparable for that purpose. But if you're an enterprise shopping for tools to decide to like build a vast enterprise suite on, Vue doesn't really compare with the Angular platform. It'd be like Vue plus a whole bunch of things from the ecosystem. You know, that as a consumer you would cobble those and group those together and say Vue plus these 10 things from its ecosystem are our platform to build on, versus Angular, the platform itself. So they're not really directly competitive in that sense. But if you haven't looked at Angular in a while, I mean, sure, the syntax is different, but it's going to look really familiar. We've got a couple of our ringers in the audience. You can always just demand one of them ask a good question.
So I'll ask a question.
Go ahead.
So, so those you talked about that platform, showed how big the platform was and all the things it could do. But if you had to give like a 1 to 2 sentence, like quick pitch of why should I pick Angular, how would you distill it down?
My pitch of, let's say that differently. It's not so much why you should choose Angular, because there's actually several other competing tools that I personally like a whole lot. So I'm not saying Angular is better. I'm saying you should consider Angular the development tool. And one of the biggest reasons you should consider is because it is part of this vast platform that makes it a great choice to build big important things at scale.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I always hear about Angular more in terms of view and like a UI layer. How well it supports the persistence of the backend layer. I mean, as a platform.
All of these pieces that I had up here, I believe these are essentially all for the front end. And that's actually a great question. This is a discussion Paul, who you can ask questions after I leave, you can probably coax him to talk about. We have come to believe that the next generation will have to consist of tools and platforms that span the front end and the back end, because that will be the only way forward to drive up that productivity and efficiency further. So we both think, as many others do, that the inevitable future we're going to be in is that your adoption process won't be tier by tier. It'll be across the tiers. In terms of what you should be considering, yeah, I mean, I think that really most of the things that you could use for middle tiers and backends and data management and state management and so on really are quite compatible with Angular as well as other competing front-end layers. If you're not familiar with GraphQL, I'd take a real hard look at GraphQL. There's great Angular GraphQL integration, for example.
Is it like graph database?
It's not a graph database. It's a graph API for talking to whatever kind of backend you want. You could use you could provide a GraphQL API to something where you have your data in Microsoft SQL Server, for example.
And this is actually not a question for Kyle, but another thing to add with your question is there's a framework called Nest framework, which is kind of small, but it's growing.
Yep.
And it is a backend framework on Node that is inspired by Angular. So if you like how Angular works and how components live and services and stuff like that, there is a Node library called Nest that looks almost the same for writing your backends, and then you can share your interfaces and things like that.
Yep.
This is complete speculation on my part, but like if they keep going on the path that they're on, I would not be surprised if like maybe in some number of years it shows up as another badge on that.
I could easily see that happening. I could easily see them just quietly, not making a big deal out of it, start having more badges appear on here for things that are not in the UI tier.
So I heard you said PWA is for mobile apps. So how well we can replace it with native apps? Like when we try to develop mobile apps for native, accessing the navigation, GPS in mobile. So can we use that PWA?
So like three or 4 years ago, like, I would have said that maybe 20% of popular native apps could be replaced with a PWA type technology, but that has accelerated enormously over the last couple of years. If you're targeting reasonably recent versions of the two biggest mobile platforms, I would guess that 70 to 80% of use cases you could meet with a PWA. It's just much less common to hit some aspect of mobile app development where you have to have native. And I would say it's mostly games occupying that remaining portion. But things like accessing location services, yeah, sure. You can, like all the common easy services you can access from a PWA.
All right. Well, I know you got to get out of here,
Yep, I
so
do.
I appreciate your time. Thanks, Kyle.
Hope you all enjoyed it.